It's a great pleasure to return to the Kansas City Public Library after 15 years. I counted, got there. Thank you, Jonathan, for proposing this, Steve, Carrie, Sophia, Pete, for making this happen, and for all of you for showing up. And thank you for the Polar Vortex for not showing up. Although it's a pleasure, I must admit to a considerable nervousness. This is my first book talk for this book. And I wanted to refamiliarize myself with how these events went. So I looked at prior YouTube events, and it made me nervous. One of the events was, I don't know how many of you were here for that. Well, if you weren't, you missed an absolute treat. Ms. McCann is charismatic. Her message is stirring and timely. I am, on the other hand, I'm a pointy-headed geek. My book, you can do bodily harm with if you throw it at someone. It has about 40 pages of notes and references. And Ms. McMahon wrote a bestseller. My book has just sold out its first printing, all of 500 copies, I think. So I figured, what can I do to match this? And so I decided, first of all, I'm going to scrub any scholarly reference. I have only 4 scholars that I cite. All 4 of them are dead. There's no prescription in this book, but I thought I might leave you at the very end, so you have to stay. Leave you with some possible cautions and thoughts about how this might influence your day-to-day lives. And I also thought I should start with a joke. One should always start with a joke. And this is a 17th century joke, and he's dead, Molière as well. And this is an interaction between Monsieur Jourdain, this upwardly climbing bourgeois. He has retained the philosophy master, and the philosophy master is explaining to him there's only prose or verse. And he says, well, really? I mean, there's only these 2 things? And he says, no, sir, everything that is not prose is verse, and everything that is not verse is prose. And Monsieur Jourdain is tremendously impressed by my faith. For more than 40 years, I've been speaking prose without knowing anything about it, and I'm much obliged to you for having taught me that. This joke has relevance to this talk for 2 reasons. I'm going to tell you that you've been behaving reasonably, most of you, most of your lives, with respect to uncertainty. Now, you may be relieved, you may feel cheated. I hope you feel relieved, and like Mr. Jourdain, you will feel grateful. There's the most serious question is, why does prose continue to play such an important role in our discourse? Why don't we speak in iambic pentameter? And I guess one reason is that would be inconvenient. It is said that ancient Indian mathematicians were required to compose their proofs in verse. Modern mathematicians have figured out that symbolic representation is much more efficient. You don't need to be a poet to be a mathematician. And much of academic discourse today is in Greek symbols and what somebody has called an avalanche of number statistics. And yet, strangely enough, the Supreme Court continues to use prose. And why don't they do what mathematicians do and economists do? And why indeed do Supreme Court arguments and judgments include similes, metaphors, analogies, and even, from time to time, a literary allusion? Why is it that ambiguous figurative expression continues to rule not just in the arts, but in many practical domains? In a nutshell, my argument is that human beings we are, let's pat ourselves on the back, we are a splendid species in our capacity to communicate. And roots apparently talk to each other, but the human capacity to communicate is extraordinary. Our use of language, for example, and our use of art is used not only to communicate facts, but it is used to communicate our imaginations. And so this is an example of cave art from 60,000 years ago. And they're clearly not, I mean, there's value to communication of actual facts, but there's also value, potentially practical value, to communicating metaphors, to communicating what we imagine. And it is said that this cave art, which may well have had a role in projecting power. Who knows? But what is the enduring practical value of what one could think of as evocative expression? And I argue that it reflects the imperative of imaginative discourse, which produces the confidence to act, and it produces the confidence to act by combining observed evidence with imagined possibilities. So we don't act on evidence alone, we combine evidence with imagined possibilities. Paradoxically, when we are confronted with uncertain possibilities, it is the imprecise give and take of figurative language and evocative language that helps resolve our disagreements. And it's creatively constructed and presented imaginaries, not just facts, that make us less afraid. I think that one could talk about discourse with oneself, soliloquy, Hamlet, and to be or not to be. But I'm going to restrict my scope to multi-sided discourse, either bilateral discourse, you and me, or group discourse. And I'm going to talk about discourse that supports willing collaboration, willing practical collaboration. One can use language to command, to order, and that is one way of resolving disagreements. But I just tell you what to do and you do it. But I'm going to restrict my scope to discourse that is multi-party and that is aimed at producing willing collaboration. The main venue, as it were, of my argument is entrepreneurship. But as you will see from some of my examples, the applications that I have in mind go far beyond entrepreneurship. And so I believe what I have is a fairly general argument. And I'm going to be referring to fairly common, everyday, not radical uncertainties. So I'm not interested in unknown unknowns. Yeah, unknown unknowns matter, but I'm interested in the kinds of uncertainties that you face every day. There's this Biret talk, should we go to it or not? And clearly some of you decided you should, some of you decided you shouldn't. You didn't have a great deal of evidence, maybe you talked it over with yourself. That's what I'm interested in. I'm going to talk first of all about the kinds and practical consequences of everyday uncertainties. Then I'm going to talk about how imaginative discourse helps us cope with these imaginative uncertainties. And then I'm going to talk about the role of routines which shape our discourse. And just to give you a little bit of a preview, the kind of discourse we have depends on the stakes. So the discourse in a traffic court where there's a $50 fine at stake is very different from discourse in a criminal trial where somebody may be acquitted of a heinous crime or sent to life imprisonment or capital punishment. I'm going to use a very ordinary language meaning of uncertainty. And in ordinary language, we can refer to uncertainty in two ways. You can think of it as a mental state. I feel uncertain. Or you can refer to it as an external situation. What Donald Trump is going to do is extremely uncertain, and I may feel uncertain. Typically, these two things connect with each other. I'm going to be talking about the mental state of doubt and doubts about what is, was, or could be. But it's also related to the external availability or non-availability of information. So typically, and there are, of course, differences from person to person, but typically when there is less information, less evidence available, we tend to feel more doubt. When there's more information, we feel less doubt. That's all pretty straightforward. I may synonymously use the mental state with external uncertainty. Don't get fussed about it. It's not worth getting fussed about. What I will emphasize is a distinction which we don't normally think very much about. And certainly my academic colleagues do not think very much about. And here I'm talking about the distinction between a one-off and a distributional or statistical uncertainty. Does high unemployment lead to crime? That's a distributional or statistical question. Did so-and-so actually commit this crime? That's a very specific question. Does a particular treatment or a particular vaccine on average have efficacious results? That's a statistical question. What treatment should so-and-so be given? That's a one-off. Why should one care? And I will argue to you that there are significant differences between the kinds of evidence we demand for one-offs and the kind of reasoning we demand for one-offs and the kind of evidence and reasoning that we demand for statistical uncertainties. So think of, as an example of statistical or distributional uncertainty, the question of whether a drug or a vaccine is efficacious. And think on the other side, the one-off of whether a particular suspect or accused is guilty of a crime. Why does O.J. Simpson's name come to mind? And on the one side, the uncertainty gets resolved by statistics or of like cases. So, for example, in a drug, you have phase 1 trials where there's no placebo, there's no control trial. It's given to maybe 5 people. It just gives you a rough sense of whether this could be efficacious or not. What really gives you confidence in a drug trial is a large, what they call pivotal trials, the phase 3 trial, where hundreds, if you're lucky, 1,000 people are enrolled, and there is there's a control, and if the treatment produces a statistically more significant outcome than the placebo, then you say it's efficacious, and if not, not. In a criminal trial, it's very different. We are looking not at statistical evidence, we are looking at contextual evidence. What happened in this particular case, in this particular circumstance? So if you have a few bits of evidence, if you have a will which says, well, the guy had a motive to kill, and if you find footprints, that sort of makes you think that person might be guilty. But you're much more confident if you have the will, if you have footprints, if you have DNA evidence, if you have a CCTV, if somebody heard somebody argue. And so it's disparate kinds of evidence. And it's the combination of this disparate kinds of evidence that makes you more or less confident. So it's a different kind of universe that we are dealing with when we're dealing with statistical uncertainties and distribution uncertainties. Likewise, there's a distinction between how one reasons, given whatever evidence one has. In the so-called one-offs, one reasons through what John Forrester, another dead guy, philosopher of science in Cambridge, called thinking in cases. Very close to Forrester's thinking in cases is what Jerome Bruner, another brilliant but unfortunately unknown psychologist, calls narrative mode reasoning, and Bruner distinguishes narrative mode reasoning from what he calls logico-scientific reasoning. And he derives this contrast between narrative and logical mode reasoning by taking 2 extreme cases. As he thinks of mathematics and the natural sciences as the extreme case of logico-scientific reasoning, and he thinks of great literature as an example of narrative mode thinking. And he says in the logico-scientific mode deals in higher causes, with higher and higher reaching for abstraction. And he says when you get to mathematics, it gets so abstract that it doesn't deal with anything practical or real at all. In the narrative mode, exemplified by literature, it deals with human or human-like intention and action, and the particulars of experience, the context, which it locates in time and place. He also says there are notable differences in standards and in what one expects. He says both good stories and well-formed logical arguments, as in math, can be used as a means for convincing another. Yet what they convince of is fundamentally different. Logical arguments convince one of their truth, stories convince one of their lifelikeness. And he says scientists may invent facts and worlds, but their world-making must eventuate in predicting something that is testably correct, is testably right, however much it may speculate. You may have string theory for physics, but in the end, string theory must produce a testable hypothesis. Stories have no such need for testability. Believability in a story is of a different order than the believability of even the speculative parts of physical theory. As it happens, narrative mode reasoning and what Forrester called thinking in cases is disdained in academia. And it's poo-pooed by statistical models. They say, it's generalization from anecdote, and it's just telling just so stories. I was on, I don't know why I'm telling you this story, but my story is full of stories, so I'm going to, so I was on a yacht once, believe it or not, and I was standing next to a guy who is now a celebrated economics professor, and he says, I don't want, let's avoid that woman standing on the other side. So I said, why? He said, well, I thought she was really smart. I got her into the PhD program in economics. She was a journalist, and she still thinks like a journalist. So I said, what do you mean she still thinks like a journalist? She says she takes one fact and makes a story out of it. And to tweak him, I said, and economists don't. He said, no, Amar, don't you realize we need at least two facts? I mean, it was a funny joke. But I think what he is missing is that the journalist may take one situation and one story, but there are an awful lot of facts which go into that story. But because it is one story, it's just not considered proper. It's considered what is called just so stories, following Rudyard Kipling. But the reality is the statistical methods can only resolve one-off uncertainties by denying their one-offness. And so statistical methods may be fine when you are dealing with statistical uncertainties, but when you're dealing with one-offs, they're no good. The example of this, which I use in my book, is the blue bus case. This is a real case, but it's been dressed up a little bit, and it's taught to countless law school students. And the blue bus case is a real case based in 1947, heard in the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And the facts of the case are as follows, which is there's a guy driving on the road, it's dark at night, he gets hit by a bus, he suffers harm, and he then sues. And he sues the Blue Bus Company on the grounds that the Blue Bus Company operates 70% of the buses in that area. And the standard for a civil trial as opposed to a criminal trial is the preponderance of evidence, not evidence beyond reasonable doubt. And what does preponderance of evidence mean? A sort of a crude way of thinking about it is more than a 50% probability. And lo and behold, if the Blue Bus Company runs 70% of the buses, of course there's a more than 50% probability that the Blue Bus Company did it. And the judge who was hearing this just dismissed this and said this is absurd. The plaintiff challenged in Massachusetts Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court also dismissed this as being absurd. And they said bald statistical evidence cannot and should not sway a jury about specific cases. And yet, that is what my academic friends believe that this is the path we should take. So now having set up what I mean by uncertainty, and in particular what I mean by one-off uncertainty, let's look at what the practical value of imaginative discourse is. One of the heroes of my book is this guy called Frank Knight, who wrote this book in 1921 called Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, which is my stepping off point for this book. And Frank Knight wrote this book, published this book, incidentally, when he was a professor at the University of Iowa, which is not very far from here. And after that, he became the founder of the Chicago School of Economics. He wrote terribly. He was a terrible lecturer as well, but he was a brilliant guy, just absolutely brilliant guy. This is what he says in his book, and he says, the existence of a problem of knowledge depends on the future being different from the past, while the possibility of the solution of knowledge of the problem depends on the future being like the past. If the future was exactly like the past, then there'd be no problem of knowledge, but it isn't. And then he further goes on to say the problems of life, or of conduct at least, arise from the fact that we know so little about the future. The essence of the situation is acting according to opinion, of greater or less foundation and value, neither entire ignorance, nor complete and perfect information, but partial knowledge. So what's the problem with that? What's the practical problem with that? The practical problem with that is, as Knight says, we act on opinion in anything having to do with the future. When we say we're acting on opinion, what we're really doing is we are using our imaginations to bridge the gap between what we know and what we don't know. So we're using our imaginations to fill in for our ignorance. And because we are autonomous human beings, at least most of us are, our imaginations are different. And because our imaginations are different, our opinions are different. And because our opinions are different, we will inevitably frequently end up with disagreements. If we could do exactly just what we wanted, if we could only do what our opinions told us, that would be fine. But even the most bullheaded entrepreneur, even the most opinionated entrepreneur has to rely on other people to give him or her dough, to buy his or her product. And so the capacity for unilateral action is highly circumscribed. And I believe it is getting even more circumscribed as our world is getting increasingly interconnected. And so how does one bridge the difference between my opinion, my imagination, and your imagination and your opinion? And I argue that it's groundedly imaginative discourse that overcomes the impossibility and the absolute impossibility of objective logico-scientific resolutions to uncertainties about one-offs. It might overcome uncertainties about statistical distributions. It isn't going to overcome disagreements about one-offs. And note the words, imaginative is straightforward. It's groundedly because it has to be at least partially based on evidence. What is the fruit that we wish to get from our groundedly imaginative discourse? So, of course, the meta fruit, as it were, is agreement. But underneath that, what are some of the goals and sub-goals? First, we need attention and interest. If you bore people, if they don't read your book, then you basically, it doesn't matter what the content of your discourse is. It's sort of like an absolute must. Then it is really helpful if people understand what you're trying to say. Because if you get their attention but they don't understand what it is that you're trying to sell them, maybe you've failed. Third, and I've already mentioned using Jerome Bruner's argument, what you say has to be plausible. It cannot be provable because nothing about a one-off is provable, but it has to ring true. And then discourse also serves the important function, particularly if you are yourself not absolutely certain about, you're not completely pig-headed. You might want to hear what people have to say, and you might wish to get some feedback. So if this is the fruit, what are the roots? What are the means of discourse? And I argue there are 4 important means. One is enactment. Frequently, the enactment is dramatic. Ms. McMahon's enactment was dramatic, and I was intensely jealous watching it, since I cannot since I cannot match it. And, like it or not, even reasonable people that's how you get attention. But frequently, and this is what I used to teach my students when I taught entrepreneurship, that good salespersonship also requires listening. You also have to sense and respond. So it's not all being theatrical like Steve Jobs was. I mean, Steve Jobs is the master of theater. But it's also listening to what people have to say. And so your enactment can sometimes be low-key. It may sometimes be so low-key that people don't even realize that you are part of their script. And if they're really good, they will not realize that you're part of the script. Secondly, as I said earlier, use evocative devices. Use metaphor and use similes, because my new business is the Uber of this, or I'm creating the Amazon of that. So you don't need to describe in minute detail what exactly your project is. And you may not be in a position to describe minutely what your project is. But by invoking a metaphor, by invoking something else that the listener is familiar with, that creates the understanding, and that also creates plausibility. I know what Amazon is, I know what Uber is, and so, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And frequently this discourse is multimedia. My book, by the way, has, as I said, a heavy book, but it has pictures. One of the pictures is this one, and it's a hokusai. I used to disdain, because I'm a geek, anything that was not paragraphs and sentences. So the idea of using a bullet point in a book, in my earlier books, I said, my God, no. The idea of putting pictures would have been unthinkable. The last time I spoke here, I had used a PowerPoint, but it did not have these visuals. And I mean, we have these tools, and they are actually, I mean, in some ways, they're impairing our capacity to communicate. They're propagating false news, but they're also, I think, significantly improving in a time where time is short, our capacity to communicate. So that's a second route, as it were, of imaginative discourse. The third, and this is probably the most counterintuitive, is the idea of imagined details. You may ask, how could make-believe facts make an argument or a discourse more plausible rather than less plausible? But think for a minute. Think about the historical dramas that you may have seen on television or on National Public Radio, or Hollywood movies. And you see that the way to get you suspend disbelief is to put in a large number of details which don't exist, but which are imagined. Those details just make you think this must be more real. A spreadsheet. I mean, I assume since you came to this talk, many of you have encountered spreadsheets before. And of course, everybody knows that 90% of the cells in that spreadsheet are made up, right? It's a given. And I used to work at McKinsey & Company before, I was the management consultants, and I would often wonder, I said, the answer to this question is so blindingly simple. Why are we spending so much of our time and sleepless nights and weekends constructing this book, which is basically full of half facts, half imagination, half assumptions? And why do our clients expect it? I've come to the point of view which I didn't realize in my 20s, and is that there's actual genuine value. So first of all, it demonstrates seriousness of purpose. I have spent the time, if I'm a Hollywood producer, if I'm an NPR, producer of a documentary drama, to give you something which seems exactly right. And so I've respected your time, and I've respected your attention. So it communicates seriousness of purpose. It also communicates that you sort of know what you're talking about. If your spreadsheet assumes that each salesperson is going to make 1,000 sales calls per day, that means you don't know what you're talking about. If you say 5 to 10, it means you have some knowledge of the domain in which you're trying to persuade someone else. And the third reason, which actually was suggested to me by a 28-year-old who I was sharing these my drafts with, is even more subtle. You know that when you start a business or when you have any kind of uncertain proposition, what is going to happen is not what you say is going to happen. This is kind of a given. The person knows that you have exercised your imagination. What the other person wants to know is that when you encounter an unexpected problem, are you resourceful or imaginative enough to work your way around it? Because whatever path you choose to work your way around it is also going to be another imagined path. And so what you're demonstrating through the provision of a great deal of imagined detail is you're demonstrating that you have the imagination to solve problems which will occur. And thank you, Matt Ford, for suggesting this. And I used to think that a business pitch is a story. And I've come to realize that it's not. So a good story has the element of surprise, the element of unexpected things happen. The whole point of writing a business plan is to say, I have thought of every possibility. So actual stories which would conform to any commonsensical definition of a story do not exist in the business plan or proposal. But entrepreneurs make a great deal of use of origin stories. I am doing this because I encountered such and such problem, and this is how I solved it. Entrepreneurs will often tell you bounce back stories. Oh, in my previous business, I did this, I nearly went bankrupt, but I managed to bounce back. It's a little bit of humble brag. How stupid was I not to anticipate this? But it happened, and I figured this out. But the brag in this is, I have the strength of character to bounce back, and here is an anecdote, or here is a story which demonstrates that. Frequently, people use archetypal tales. Another famous classmate, now deceased, of Jonathan's and mine, was Clay Christensen. And Clay Christensen has had a greater impact on modern English than practically anybody I know of. So if you use the word disruptive, you can thank Clay Christensen for having put disruptive front and center into everything we say. I resolutely refuse to use the word disruptive because I am annoyed by it. Clay had this story about the innovator's dilemma, and the idea is that people start off in some niche, and they offer you something that is cheap. It's not as good as what the main product is, but it's good enough for some people, and then they gradually work up that niche. And the incumbent who's been fat and happy or content then succumbs to the fact that your product has improved and gets you. This is a fine story. It does not, in fact, conform to a great deal of innovation. The story evokes the David and Goliath myth, which we've all grown up with. It evokes the Greek tragedy, in which the hero inevitably succumbs to circumstance. So it resonates, and all you want really is attention and resonance. The fact that these stories don't fit, let's say, half of innovation is irrelevant. It is still nonetheless a powerful story, and people in business will often pitch their businesses as minds of disruptive innovation, and it speaks to people. You might think this is just a con job, that all the stuff making up facts and storytelling, it's just a con job aimed at gullible targets. No, it's not. And this is from an unprompted Amazon review by a venture capital veteran. I think he was in Jonathan's undergraduate class. He's been a venture capitalist for quite a long time. I didn't urge him to buy my book. I didn't urge him to write an Amazon review, but he wrote a really lengthy and very thoughtful review, and I've accepted things from it. And he says, a great talent for an entrepreneur is the ability to imagine a successful outcome and to be able to describe that outcome to providers of capital, to prospective employees, and to prospective customers. Each of these audiences must find the story compelling for progress to occur. They will not be lured by false precision. Everybody knows that most enterprises do not succeed. But people are lured by the quality of the stories. And in that sense, they participate in the act of imagination themselves. So VCs are hard-nosed. They're in there to make a return for the investors. But storytelling is very much part of what they do. Let me turn to the third piece of my talk, which is routines and conventions. In narrative, there are genres. In novels, there are the detective fiction stories, for example, the science fiction. This is from something I scraped off the web, and he says the genre conventions are the specific elements, themes, and characteristics commonly found within a particular genre. They help audiences quickly identify the genre and expectations for the narrative or style. Over time, these conventions become recognized standards for their genre. You might say, oh, this is just a formula, and who wants to go see a formula movie? But you become uncomfortable going to see a spy movie which does not conform to some unwritten conventions of the genre of a spy thriller novels. And they serve an enormous purpose. They're not locked in stone. Genres evolve. So in Aristotle's time, there was tragedy and there's comedy, and that's it. And genres have evolved. But you violate these genres at your peril, and I have foolishly violated the genre of the academic book and the general interest book, and let's see if I survive, or the book survives. So there are crazy people who violate the genre, but it's not advised. These conventions are helpful not only in fiction, not only in music. If you go to musical performance, there are also genres. If you go to see art, then you expect something of a particular genre. But this is also equally true in practical discourse, because they set the expectations and rules of engagement for the discourses. These genres vary in practical discourse in the degree of groundedness and the degree of plausibility. How plausible does something have to be? How much detail, actual detail, versus how much imagination? They vary in the degree of the strictness of scrutiny. So the strictness of scrutiny in a criminal trial is going to be far more strict than a traffic court strictness. And they also vary in the degree of scrutiny by peers, bosses, and outsiders. And the factors that affect reasonable strictness and multi-party oversight tend to depend on the stakes and spillovers. So if you do things where the stakes are extremely high, or if the spillovers to other people are great, you're going to see more strict. If you're just going to do something inside your home, the strictness of the building code is going to be different than if you're going to rebuild your home and perpetuate a monstrosity which your neighbors will have to look at every day. So the complexity of what you're doing also affects the degree of strictness and oversight, and uniqueness. If you're doing something that is truly, really unique, you really cannot have too strict a demand for evidence because there's no evidence. These routines and conventions also affect funding sources. So there's a three-way interaction between the kinds of routines that are used in a commercial enterprise, the uncertainty, complexity, and resources required for an uncertain enterprise, and the sources where you get your dough from. And this ends up, I believe, with the following kind of entrepreneurial ecosystem. So this is a sort of my image of a whitewater canoe, believe it or not. And that's the self-financed or informally financed entrepreneur. There's not much evidence. There's a great deal of missing information. Uncertainty is high. On the bottom right-hand corner, it's a three-masted schooner. It's a public company project. And that's where the investments are much larger because they have access to public markets, and the strictness of routines is much larger. And in between, you have businesses that are started by angel-backed investors or VC-backed investors. So there isn't obviously a genre or a mode of reasonableness. It varies. I also want to emphasize one thing, because this is a misunderstanding which many people have, which is the notion that large public companies are basically caretakers, or that they are completely averse to any kind of uncertainty. It is certainly true that the demand for evidence at an IBM is going to be different from the demand for evidence of someone who's starting a venture in a garage. But it is not true that the uncertainty that of the initiatives that the large companies face is zero. It cannot be true. It is impossible that any venture, whether undertaken by a large company or a small company or an entrepreneur, can have zero uncertainty. That's the way the world is. Nor is it possible that you can have a strictness standard, even in a large, seemingly bureaucratic company, that is like a beyond reasonable doubt standard of a criminal trial. So even in large companies, there is scope, and sometimes considerable scope, for the exercise of imagination, for the exercise of subjective judgment. And if there weren't, these companies would die, and they would never grow. But if they don't grow, they die. I've been recently writing case histories of medical innovation. So even in large, highly regulated pharmaceutical companies, there is, within the bureaucratic structure, considerable scope for personal relationships, personal credibility, storytelling, and so on. The other interesting thing is that these conventions tend to evolve. So Amazon starts off with principally founder financing, extreme uncertainty, relatively low investment, and not much strictness of routines. And then over time, fairly quickly in Amazon's case, they raise angel financing. That angel financing enables them to do more expensive stuff, like launch their store. Then they get funding from venture capitalists that finances the initial growth. And then we get into public funding. And the public funding allows them to diversify into things like the cloud, and it allows them to engage in what they call exponential scaling. So that is a progression. And part of the problems that many entrepreneurs face is that their routines do not evolve. So they either believe that what we're doing is just fine, that's not a formula for survival, or they think, oh, when I was young, when I started this business, I proceeded entirely by the seat of my pants. And look how successful I am. That too is a formula for failure. Let me make a few concluding comments, which will, there's an ancient scholarly prejudice against studying one-offs. And it goes back to Aristotle. And this is Forrester's claim about Aristotle. He says, for Aristotle, there can only be the knowledge of the universal and the necessary. For what is individual and what is contingent cannot be the object of knowledge, claims Aristotle. And action based on practical wisdom must also recognize the particulars, for it is practical, and practice is concerned with the particulars. This is why some who do not know, and especially those who have experience, are more practical than those who know. But it's not a science. I mean, practical wisdom engages with the individual, but can only do so in blindness. there can be no science of the individual. That is Aristotle's assertion. John Stuart Mill said, no, the way we really reason is from particular to particular. But my colleagues still believe in the Aristotelian way. In fact, it's become worse. So even in practical wisdom, where Aristotle was willing to recognize the importance of the blind practitioner who doesn't know why he or she is doing anything, even that is disdained by the modern expert. The modern expert says, follow the science. We talk about translational medicine. From up high, somebody's going to do cutting-edge biology, and we're going to translate it somehow into treatments. Or follow the evidence. Evidence uber alles. That is another mantra which is constantly offered to you. And there's a disdain, and a dysfunctional disdain, for contextual differences. So if I have a time series, I am good. That's all I need. And it's dysfunctional because what you end up with is our blind bets on historical patterns. And again, I said this from my book, Bertrand Russell had invented this idea of the inductivist turkey. And the inductivist turkey gets, like clockwork, fed at 9 o'clock in the morning by the farmer. And the inductivist turkey, like people who follow the statistics and follow the evidence, says, this is a foolproof formula. At 9 o'clock, I get fed. And indeed, at 9 o'clock, the turkey gets fed until Thanksgiving. So you end up in believing evidence and not recognizing that the world is not a stationary place. That what happened the day before Thanksgiving may not be the same thing as what happens at Thanksgiving. The turkey's case may be an extreme case, but the uncertainties of one-offs are absolutely banal. We live in a world of relentless enterprise, which makes uncertainty ubiquitous and mundane. You may be minding your business, and you may have a small little business repairing typewriters, but sorry, dear chap, personal computers have been invented. You may make a nice living running a gas station. Sorry, fella, there are things like EVs. The past is an imperfect guide. I mean, it's a valuable guide. I disagree with Henry Ford, who said history was bunk, but it is an imperfect guide, and we should recognize that its imperfections. There is now this belief in machine learning magic. And put this all into a computer, the computer will figure it out. But look under the hood, and what is really going on under the hood is Bertrand Russell's inductivist turkey. So what is going on underneath the hood is a statistical model. It may be a very complex model. It may have 1 trillion variables or however many variables it has. But it is a model that assumes the world is a stationary place. To confront the uncertainties of one-offs, you must imagine, and machines cannot imagine. Or if they imagine, the imagination is programmed and produces hallucinations. Some salient features of imaginative discourse, I'm repeating myself, but it's worth repeating. Imaginative discourse bridges observable evidence, what happened, and what we imagine will happen in the future. It relies to a considerable degree on metaphorical evocations. It imagines details and parts, so don't poo-poo facts which are made up, don't poo-poo assumptions in a spreadsheet, even though 90% of these spreadsheets, it's a conversation piece, a good spreadsheet. And evidence complements, it does not replace imagination. And I was very flattered, this is a line from my book, I was very flattered to find the former governor of the Bank of England plucked the sentence for my book, and he used it in a speech he gave recently about inflation targeting. And the context was that at some point, central bankers were told, oh, you must have quantitative numerical inflation targets. And so they then instructed their economists to say, give us a model in which pulling this lever will get us to our 2% inflation target. And these economists did what they were told, and they produced this model. And lo and behold, the model failed. And the reason the models failed because the models were constructed based on history. And as Lord Mervyn King recognizes, because he had to confront this, the world changes. And therefore, the only way you can deal with this is to exercise imagination. So, of course, you may rely on the evidence of what happened in the last business cycle. But if that's all you rely on, you're going to make a terrible mistake. I have also suggested to you that the content and process of how this imaginative discourse works is shaped by organizational routines. These routines in business tend to be shaped by the stakes, novelty, and complexity of what you're doing. These routines tend to be stable but not static. In that sense, they are like literary routines. Routines are stable, so they give you some sense of what the audience expects, but they're not static. They have to change over time. So it's a fine balance between conforming to what the audience expects, but also changing, at least gradually, with how your circumstances are changing, and that the differences in these routines sustain a diverse, innovative ecosystem. So the small business, the angel-backed business, the large company, they're all entrepreneurial. They have to be entrepreneurial. But they are differently entrepreneurial. And they're differently entrepreneurial because their decision-making process follows a different kind of routine. Although there's no prescription in this book, I thought I might leave you with some practical cautions and suggestions. They're fairly self-evident. Don't treat one-offs as distributional problems. Beware of statistical extrapolations, including LLMs. Be especially afraid of LLMs because you don't even realize that they are ultimately statistical extrapolations. Demand plausible, comprehensible, contextualized explanations. If somebody says, I'm an expert, I know what I'm doing, trust me, explain this to me. And explain this to me not in terms of a statistical model, explain to me why this would work here and how this aligns with what is going on now. And don't be cowed by black boxes and quote-unquote well-controlled experiments. Another scam which has been perpetuated and which people have gotten Nobel Prizes for is the well-controlled trial. And the way you do a well-controlled trial is you abstract away from anything real, from stuff which your intervention is supposed to work in. And so these things either will nix things which could very well work in a particular circumstance, or they will endorse things which happen to work under the particular circumstances that were used in the trial and won't work anywhere else. So don't be fooled by that. Take routine seriously. When you sort of routine, how boring, this is what bureaucrats do. No, it isn't. Designing a routine, if you're in business, is one of your principal tasks. You're not only making decisions about a particular investment, you're also making decisions about how people in the organization are evaluating decisions, and it's a difficult one. They can't be too tight, they can't be too bureaucratic, nor can they be too loose. They need a certain amount of stability. They need to be somewhat predictable, but they cannot be fossilized because your business changes. And equally, beware of the capricious go-for-broke visionary. Oh, I'm the CEO. 30% of the code you write is going to be AI-based, or this is the future. And don't come to me with facts and arguments. I know because I'm the visionary. And it's interesting that even someone like Steve Jobs, who had the reputation, a justified one, for being a visionary, never really stepped beyond what the technology was capable of doing. He, in fact, held Apple back. And then last piece of advice is to myself, which is from Will Rogers, which is never miss a good opportunity to shut up. Thank you. This is time for questions, but I'll also do a little bit of branding, and this is the book.
What is your opinion of scenario planning as pioneered by Ari Digi at Shell Oil and others as well? that asks a different kinds of questions. It doesn't ask what the future is going to be. It poses alternative futures and says, if this is the future, then what do we do to prepare for it now? And how do we recognize what future is unfolding?
Various people have tried scenario planning, and it's never caught on, and I do not understand why it has not caught on, but the fact is that it has not caught on. The only place where it has caught on is the military. So the military engages in wargaming. I once, for a year, shared an office with Pierre Wack, who was the father of scenario planning at Shell. And so his claim to fame was that he foresaw the oil crisis. And Pierre, incidentally, was a literary chap. He had an Indian guru, and he used to go to Banaras. So he was a journalist, actually, before he became head of strategy at. So Pierre was very much in the narrative mode of reasoning. Also, he said, you need a ton of evidence, and then you have to bolt that evidence somehow to an imaginative scenario. And the example he used to give that was that when there's heavy snowfall near Hardwar, there will be floods in the Ganges downstream. And so it is important to know that there's heavy snowfall in Hardwar before there are floods downstream. I think it may be that outside of the oil industry, there just aren't that many facts that you can reliably hang your hat on. But I don't know. I must admit to my perplexity as to why. And Pierre and then his successor wrote a nice article in HBR, and people read it, but they don't do it.
I realize you're focused on enterprise, on entrepreneurialism, but it's reminding me some also of C.P. Snow and the idea of the two cultures. And do you see this as kind of an attempt at that reconciliation of getting, the humanities and the sciences to see a more complete view?
Because it is another subject very dear to my heart. I'm a great fan of C.P. Snow's two cultures with science on the one side and the humanities on the other. The gulf that I'm interested in a different project is the gulf between what Aristotle called practical wisdom, which is not science in that sense, and the humanities. And I think what the engineer does, what the business person does, what the nurse does, what the educationist does, that has a lot to gain from embracing narrative mode discourse.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bede, and thank you all for coming tonight.